If you grew up in America during the 1950s, the 1960s, or even the early 1970s, you probably remember one room that quietly brought the whole family together. Not the living room, not the kitchen, and not the front porch. The dining room. Back then, it wasn't just another room in the house. It had a purpose. Almost every evening, around the same time, life seemed to slow down. Dad's car pulled into the driveway. The evening news was still a little while away. Children finished whatever game they were playing outside because they knew what came next. Dinner. Inside the house, something familiar was happening. The smell of roast chicken, meatloaf, pot roast, or maybe a casserole that had been in the oven since late afternoon. Someone was setting the table. Plates, forks, glasses, napkins folded by hand. If it was Sunday, or Thanksgiving, or Christmas, the good china came out. The plates that spent most of the year safely tucked away inside a china cabinet. As children, many of us weren't even sure we were allowed to touch them. Those dishes weren't expensive because of what they were made of. They were valuable because of the memories attached to them. When everything was ready, someone called out, "Dinner's ready." And somehow, everyone came. No text messages, no reminders. You simply knew. For the next 30 or 40 minutes, the outside world could wait. Parents asked about school. Children told stories that seemed incredibly important at the time. Someone always reached for the potatoes before they were passed properly. Someone always wanted seconds. Sometimes there were disagreements. Sometimes there was complete silence after a long day. But everyone was there, looking at one another, sharing the same meal. At the time, it didn't feel unusual. It felt ordinary. And maybe that's why so few people realized just how special it was. By the end of this story, you'll know what slowly pulled that room apart, and what America quietly traded away with it. The dining room was never just a place to eat. It was where children learned to wait their turn before speaking, where they learned that someone else always got served first, where please and thank you became habits instead of lessons, where grandparents quietly passed along family stories that would never appear in history books. No one called it quality time. It was simply dinner. Today, that room is quieter. So, what changed? Was it television, frozen dinners, longer workdays, fast food, open floor plans, or was it something much harder to see? The truth is, the American dining room wasn't undone by a single invention, or one generation. It slowly faded as the rhythm of everyday life changed. And the first crack didn't appear in the walls. It appeared in the family schedule. Let's go back to the late 1950s, when a glowing box in the corner of the living room quietly began competing for something far more valuable than attention. It began competing for America's evenings. If you ask someone when the American dining room began to disappear, they'll often point to open floor plans, or kitchen islands, or modern homes. But by the time those changes arrived, the real transformation had already begun. To understand it, we have to go back to the late 1950s, because something new had entered the American home: the television. By then, television was no longer a luxury. It had become part of everyday life. Families gathered around it to watch the evening news, the Ed Sullivan Show, Bonanza, or The Wonderful World of Disney. Programs that everyone at work or school would be talking about the next day. For the first time, the dinner table had to compete for the family's attention. At first, nothing seemed different. Dinner was still served. The family still gathered. The television stayed off until the meal was over. Or at least, that was the plan. The sound of a favorite program drifted in from the living room. Then, little by little, the routine began to bend. Can we watch while we eat? Just this one show. It starts at 7. One evening became another. The exceptions slowly became the habit. Around the same time, another quiet revolution arrived. In 1953, a company called Swanson introduced something Americans had never really seen before: the TV dinner. Turkey, stuffing, sweet potatoes, peas, all neatly arranged inside a single aluminum tray. By 1955, Swanson had sold more than 25 million of them. But the idea wasn't just the food, it was where the food was meant to be eaten. Not around the dining table, but on a folding tray in front of the television. For many families, the living room quietly became the new place to eat. It was convenient. It was fast. And for millions of families, it felt like the future. The television dinner wasn't the end of family meals, but it represented something new. For perhaps the first time in modern American life, eating and talking no longer had to happen together. The meal survived. The ritual began to change. Looking back, it's easy to imagine that this happened overnight. It didn't. It happened slowly. One television program, one folding tray, one meal carried into the living room, one conversation postponed until tomorrow. One evening when someone said, "Let's eat in here tonight," and then another and another, until it no longer felt unusual. By the early 1970s, many American families still treasured dinner together, but the rhythm had begun to change. And once a daily ritual begins to bend, even for good reasons, it's remarkably difficult to restore. The next change wouldn't come from the living room, it would come from the kitchen. And it would promise Americans something they had always wanted: more time, or so it seemed. By the early 1970s, many Americans still had a dining room, but something about it felt different. It wasn't disappearing overnight. It was quietly losing its place in everyday life. To understand why, we have to go back to the years just after World War II. America was changing faster than ever before. Millions of servicemen returned home. They got married, started families, and dreamed of something their parents had rarely been able to afford: a home of their own. The country suddenly needed millions of new houses. Fast, but years before those neighborhoods filled America's suburbs, one architect was already imagining a different kind of American home. His name was Frank Lloyd Wright. Decades earlier, Wright challenged the traditional layout of the American house. He believed families shouldn't be separated into a series of small, isolated rooms. Instead, he imagined homes where family life flowed more naturally from one space to another. The dining room wasn't meant to disappear. It was meant to feel connected to the rest of the home. It was a beautiful idea, one that would quietly influence generations of architects long after it was first drawn on paper. While architects like Frank Lloyd Wright were rethinking how homes could be designed, builders like William Levitt were changing how millions of homes could actually be built. Today, Levitt is often called the father of modern suburbia. He didn't invent the suburbs, but he transformed the way they were built. In places like Levittown, New York, his company could build thousands of homes with astonishing speed. Every wall that could be simplified, every square foot that could be used more efficiently, helped lower construction costs and made home ownership possible for millions of young families. To millions of families, these weren't simply houses. They were the American dream. A front lawn, a backyard for the children, a quiet street. A future that finally felt within reach. Inside those homes, the dining room was still there. Sunday dinners remained a tradition. Holiday meals still brought families together. But everyday life was beginning to look different. Breakfast rarely happened in the dining room. Children grabbed a bowl of cereal before school. Parents finished a quick cup of coffee before leaving for work. Lunches were packed at the kitchen counter. Weeknight meals became simpler, quicker, less formal. Little by little, the kitchen became more than a place to cook. it became a place to eat. Many new homes also featured what builders called an eat-in kitchen. For ordinary weeknight meals, more families stayed there instead of walking into the formal dining room. And builders noticed. Architecture rarely changes the way people live. More often, people change the way houses are built. As families naturally spent more time in the kitchen, home designs slowly followed. The doorway between the kitchen and the dining room became wider. Then the walls became smaller. Eventually, in many new homes, there wasn't a separate dining room at all. Just one larger space where cooking, eating, and living blended together. By the 1980s and 1990s, open floor plans were becoming the new American ideal. They made homes feel larger and allowed parents to cook while still being part of family life. The dining room hadn't been deliberately removed. It had simply become part of something bigger. Looking back, it's tempting to blame architecture for what happened. But architecture was following a change that had already begun. The walls didn't come down first. The routine did. The next chapter wouldn't be about houses. It would be about time. And America's growing belief that every minute could be saved. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the American family wasn't disappearing. It was becoming busier. More households depended on two incomes. For many parents, balancing work and family life had become a daily challenge. Longer commutes became common. Children hurried from school to Little League games, dance lessons, music practice, church activities, and homework waiting at home. Before long, the family calendar had become almost as important as the family dinner table. Finding 1 hour when everyone happened to be home at the same time became surprisingly difficult. Dinner slowly stopped being the event the day revolved around. Instead, it became something families tried to fit between everything else. Convenience wasn't changing American life. It was responding to it. The microwave became an everyday appliance. Meals that once required planning could now be ready in just a few minutes. Frozen dinners became weeknight solutions. Yesterday's roast became tonight's quick meal. For busy families, the microwave wasn't a luxury. It was a lifeline. Fast food answered the same problem. Baseball practice started in 20 minutes. There wasn't enough time to cook. So dinner came through a drive-through window, or inside a pizza box carried through the front door. Most parents weren't choosing convenience over family. They were choosing convenience for their family. They were doing what parents have always done, making the best decisions they could with the time they had. But every solution changes something. But they were no longer ending the day together. Looking back, there wasn't one evening when the American family stopped gathering around the dinner table. There was no announcement, no national decision. Just thousands of ordinary evenings when someone quietly said, "Go ahead and eat without me." And then another, and another, until those words no longer sounded unusual. Perhaps that's how traditions disappear. Not with a single dramatic moment, but one ordinary Tuesday at a time. By the end of the 20th century, the dining room hadn't disappeared. The habit had. Because a room can survive for generations. But a tradition survives only if people keep showing up. And once that daily ritual quietly slipped away, the room slowly lost the reason it had been built. The final chapter of this story wouldn't be about time. It would be about attention. Walk through almost any American neighborhood built during the 1950s or 1960s, and chances are you'll still find a dining room. The room never truly disappeared. The table is still there. The chairs are still there. In many homes, the china cabinet still stands quietly against the wall, holding dishes that are brought out only once or twice a year. The room is still waiting for Thanksgiving, waiting for Christmas, waiting for birthdays, waiting for one more evening when everyone happens to be there at the same time. Maybe that's why old family photographs feel so different. We're not remembering the wallpaper, or the chandelier, or the china cabinet. We're remembering who was sitting around the table, the conversations, the laughter, the ordinary evenings that seemed so ordinary until they were gone. Perhaps that's what nostalgia really is. Not missing a room, missing a feeling. Somewhere, on an ordinary evening in the early 1960s, a mother called out, "Dinner's ready." And without thinking, everyone came. Maybe that's what we've been searching for all along. Not another dining room, not another decade, just one quiet hour when everyone we loved happened to be home. We were never nostalgic for the room. We were nostalgic for the people who filled it. Did your family have that hour? Do you still have a dining room, and when's the last time you actually ate in it? Drop it in the comments. I read every one. And if this found you tonight, you're exactly who this channel was made for. Hit subscribe and stay a while at Faded America.